So in our last video, we saw the changes that have happened in global Christianity in the last 100 years, where the shift has gone from the global north or North America and Europe being the areas of the world that sent or that had the most Christians and sent the most missionaries, to the global south now being the place that has the most Christians. And so what I want to do in this video is show or talk about what does that mean? Where do we go from here? Given these shifts in the upcoming decades. And so I first want to look at the Christian population, or the projected Christian population in 2050, so in about 3 decades from now, and what that means then for us. So just by looking at this chart, you can see the significant increase of Christians in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And you'll note specifically that that they are now, or that they are projected to dwarf the number of Christians in North America and in Europe. So you see that the number of Christians in North America has grown a little, at least with 242 million, but the number of Christians in Europe has actually gone backwards. It's actually shrank from over 500 million back down to 483 million, while in Africa, the projected number of Christians is 1.2 billion, which is a huge number, of course. And so Christianity is just going to rapidly multiply and increase in Africa, or projected to at least. And the same thing with Asia and Latin America. So you can see here from this chart a better comparison, at least. So you now see, or you will soon see at least, that in Asia, Latin America, the number of Christians will quickly go past the number in North America and in Europe. And Africa, it just exponentially goes up. I mean, it has more than double, or it's projected to have more than double the number of Christians that are in Europe, at least. So these shifts that we've seen over the last 100 years are going to just continue, or they're projected to continue to increase in this same direction. And so then the question is, what do we do given these realities? What things should happen? So again, the shift in focus now moves from the West primarily sending missionaries to the global South, to the global South now sending missionaries all over the place. Many missionaries they're going to send within their own borders to different people groups, but then they're also going to be sending missionaries into other countries, including Europe and the United States and other parts of North America. And so you have a little bit of what we call reverse missions, right? Americans used to be sending missionaries to the global South, and now the global South will be sending missionaries to Europe and to North America, as well as other parts of the globe. So this diagram isn't meant to be scientific necessarily, but just to show that the global South now has been and will continue to increase sending missionaries all over the world. And so what does that mean then? Where do we go from here? Well, first, I want to just emphasize that there's always a need for church planting and Bible translation. So I'm going to highlight theological education in a few minutes, but I want you to hear very clearly that I'm saying that there's always a need for church planting and Bible translation. As long as there are places that have not heard the gospel before, there's going to be need for churches. And as long as there are languages without the Bible in their mother tongue, then we need Bible translators. Now, what'll be interesting, I think, over the next 30 years is some of those church planting teams will no longer be monocultural. Prior to this, and even currently, there's often teams from the same country, say going into the Middle East or going into Asia, all Americans or all Europeans. I think that's going to start shifting into international teams now going together. So you can have a team with someone from Africa, someone from North America, someone from Asia to plant a church in, say, the Middle East. So there's going to be a lot of different strategies with international cooperation now among Christians. And I think we're going to see that more. That's starting now in kind of seed form, but I think it's going to continue as the number of Christians continues to increase in other parts of the world. There's also, of course, a need for development. So I mentioned that many people in the world live in places that have substandard levels of hygiene and and healthcare. And so, of course, there's always a need for building wells, for hospitals, medical care, agriculture. There's always a need for those things. And so I think that will continue to increase, especially as the number of Christians in those areas of the world increases, those that are in poverty or in highly corrupt societies. They're going to need continual development. And third, and this goes along with number one and number two in one sense, is there's a need to go to the least reached. And so there's just to throw some statistics, which may or may not be helpful, but there's one Protestant Christian worker in the US per 304 people. Whereas when we compare this first ratio I give you is there's one Protestant American Christian worker per 4.8 million people in Muslim countries. So what you can see clearly is that there are very few American Protestant Christians in Muslim countries. Now, that's actually even worse in Hindu countries, where there's one Protestant American worker for every 5.4 million Hindus, or in Hindu countries. So again, I just want to highlight, this has been a trend in missions for the last few decades at least, is to highlight the needs of the unreached, that there are places where the gospel has not been heard before. And the Middle East, of course, is one of those places. Hindu countries, particularly India, because India has such a large population, there's very few Protestant American workers in those countries. Now, there's visa issues in some of these countries, of course. So the logistics of getting into some of these countries is a separate conversation, but I at least want to highlight the need for this. Now, fourth, and where I want to spend most of my time talking about, because of course this is my bias and my interest, but that is the need for training and discipleship, or training and theological education, however you want to look at that. But training, discipleship, theological education are all kind of, broadly speaking, the same category. And so the reason there's a need for this is that the Center for the Study of Global Christianity estimates that there are a total of 5 million pastors or priests in all Christian traditions worldwide. So 5 million. Now, of those 5 million, only about 5%, or 250,000, are likely to have a formal theological training or formal theological education. So that's undergrad Bible degree, that could be a master's degree, but only 5% of those worldwide, of Christians, Christian pastors or priests worldwide, have formal theological training. And a really low number, of course, 5%. And as the church grows in the global south, there's going to be a need for more training of them, because most untrained people are in other parts of the world. To show this ratio, or mention this ratio again, is there's one trained pastor. So now I'm kind of narrowing our definitions here. There's one trained pastor for every 450,000 people outside of the United States. In the US, though, it's 1 per 230. So you can see that the vast disparity that exists here in the number of trained people per person in the United States versus the number of trained per person worldwide. And so a survey was done back in 2012, so it's a little dated in that sense. It's about 9 years old at this point. But I think actually that the survey would probably be even higher now at this point. But most church and seminary leaders throughout the world said that there's not enough theological schools in the regions of the world where Christianity is growing rapidly. So Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. And so, again, and because of the rapid growth of Christianity in the global south, there has not been a commensurate growth of theological education in those parts of the world. And so that tells us that there's a huge need for that. One of the reasons that we might still see the Western world as the center of global Christianity. So again, numbers-wise, in terms of number of Christians, the Western world is no longer the center of global Christianity. For the past probably 50 years, 30, 40 years or so, it's been the global south, primarily. But we can still have this perception of the West being the center of global Christianity. And part of that is historical, that we still have in mind, 1910 through 1970 being the example where there's more Christians here than elsewhere. Hopefully this video has dispelled some of that there's more Christians in the global South than there is here. But another reason that the Western world is seen to be the center of global Christianity is because of the number of theological schools, the number of Bible colleges, the number of seminaries that exist both in the United States as well in Canada, as well as in Europe itself. And not just theological education, but resources. The West is still central. So the number of Christian books is a good example of this. There's tens of thousands of Christian books published in English each year in the West, whereas I can't even find numbers for that in other parts of the world, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, because it's just harder to track, and there's many fewer resources that are either translated from the West or that are just written by national leaders in those countries. There's a push in that direction from places like Lexham, but it still isn't happening, of course, in large numbers. So one of the reasons we still see the West as the center of global Christianity is theological education, and then just resources, books, articles, different things of that nature that keep the West central in that regard. But again, given the reality of the lack of training in other parts of the world and the abundance of training here, there's a need to begin shifting what we do and how we send missionaries, to start more seriously considering sending missionaries to help equip theologically and to disciple national churches. So obviously we want to still send church planters, translators, and those for relief and development. But we need to begin seeing the need to raise up national leaders to carry the baton of church planting, evangelism, and missions. So one example I want to give of this that kind of highlights this is, so in a given theological school, a Bible college, seminary in America, if one job is posted for a New Testament, Old Testament, or theology professor, kind of at minimum, if it's a typical evangelical school, they could probably get 50 applicants, but potentially up to 150. Again, this is for one job. You can have that many people apply for one position. And I should add that most of these people are qualified for the job. They have the requisite academic credentials, they have experience in the field, they have publications. And so you have an abundance of qualified people applying for jobs in the West, whereas in Asia and Africa and Latin America, of course, a job is posted, which would be rare because it's for schools that have a little more informal training or are not as central as schools in the West. There's not nearly enough people, that there's so many needs for teaching that there could be any number of people that could come. And so there was an article written, I'll cite this in the bibliography, but by Keith Campbell, and he highlighted two aspects. He highlighted first that there's a need for qualified people of any field to go overseas, because there are universities throughout the world that would love to have someone with a PhD in business or in science, math, whatever it may be, to teach and be paid by that university. And this is a strategic way, of course, for Christians to enter into a country. They can enter with qualified credentials. They have a job. If they have a job, they're probably not even being supported as missionaries. And so they could use this as a avenue for evangelism, church planting. The second thing Campbell highlights is, again, the huge need there is for people with theological training to go into the majority world. He highlights the abundance of people that have masters and PhDs in Bible and theology in the US versus those in other parts of the world. And so again, it just points out that there's a crying need for qualified people to go to other parts of the world. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why training and discipleship is strategic. So I'm highlighting that this is a huge need. That given the number of Christians that the growth of Christianity in the global South, that one of the things we need to focus on most is training and discipleship of national believers. And it might be just intuitive to you why that's important or why that would be effective, but I want to give some kind of practical examples if you aren't sold on that. So this is just a few comments about evangelism strategy to explain why equipping nationals is actually an effective strategy itself. So again, I'm going to talk about evangelism, but I'm going to apply this at the end to training and equipping national leaders. And so the fact is that the gospel often expands within a community, but does not normally move across boundaries between peoples. So people that have a different language or different culture, the gospel doesn't often naturally move across, but in a similar culture, right, similar language, similar cultural customs, the gospel can expand a little more easily and freely there. And so people can influence their near neighbors who have similar language and culture that they understand, but different cultures makes it difficult for the gospel to jump. It's not impossible, just hear that clearly, it's not impossible, but it is more difficult to jump. And so what the essential missionary task then is to establish a viable indigenous church, which can then multiply and evangelize the rest of those within that people group that are much more akin language and culturally. And so there's two different scales that missiologists use to talk about this. The first is they call it the E scale, which it gauges the cultural distance crossed by those who do evangelism. So if you're trying to do evangelism, this is what this scale is referring to. So E0 evangelism is one that takes place within the church. So these are people that may already attend your church or they attend church activities, but they may not be Christian at this point. E1 then is evangelism that takes place outside the church, but to the same culture, right? So this could be people around the corner. They don't attend your church, but they're similar culture, at least. E2 then is evangelism. It's a cross-cultural evangelism into a similar but different culture. And so possibly the same language, but this could be evangelism from suburbs into urban areas or urban back to the suburbs. Or going across to different ethnic portions of the same city. So there may be different ethnic enclaves like a Chinatown in San Francisco or Los Angeles. And this would be expanding the gospel into those areas, doing evangelism into those areas if you're American or a white American at least. And so it's a similar culture. They may still live within your country, but it's different. It's definitely not the same thing as evangelizing the majority population of your church. And so when you do this, you need to be more aware of cultural additions to biblical practices, maybe the style of music. So you're more aware of it. But again, it's still not completely cross-cultural. Then E3, of course, is cross-cultural evangelism that takes the message to cultures very different from that of the messenger. So again, we primarily see this with commissioning of missionaries to live and work in a different culture. And here, there's a huge need to identify barriers, gaps in accepting the gospel by other cultures. So you need to be much more aware and sensitive of culture as you go from E0 to E3. Now, again, this might be obvious, but E0 and E1 are much easier for a church to engage in. So it's much easier to evangelize people in the E0 or E1 category because they're the same culture. It's much more difficult for churches to evangelize in E2 and E3. The gospel here has to jump across barriers for this to happen. Now, the P scale here is the flip side of this one. So it looks at the cultural distance of those who are evangelized and the cultural distance they would be required to cross in order to be part of an existing church. So again, E looks at the church doing evangelism. P looks at the proselyte or convert coming to faith and what barriers they would have to cross. So P0 is same thing. It's people at home in a local church setting. So maybe people that were already part of a church in their culture, they've already attended, but they may not have professed belief yet. P1 is people who could fit in at a local church, but there's some adjustment. So this I would use as an example, the typical non-Christian who does not know church language or know what churches do, right? They may have never attended a church before or not had family members that are Christian, but it's in the same culture. They still live in America or whatever country or specific area you live in. Again, this could be people that live around the corner from your church that have never attended church before. P2 then is these are people who would have to sacrifice themselves culturally to belong to a local church. This would require a significant loss of friendship, possibly some family ties as well. And so an example of this would be people of different ethnicities joining a local fellowship. So it's a little bit outside their culture. It's not completely removed, but it is outside it. And so these are the kinds of people that would see difficulty in belonging to a church while remaining within their natural community. So there's definite cultural barriers in these cases. So another example of this would be Muslims coming to faith within a local church in a Middle Eastern country, right? So to a church of other similar ethnic believers, but again, because they're Muslim going to a Christian context, there's a gap there. They would lose community, they would lose family, even though they're still in the same ethnicity of people. But the religious side of things is different. And then P3 is, of course, people for whom there is no local community or no local church, rather, that they could understand or in which they could reasonably participate. So these are indigenous people with no Christian work among them. These are unreached peoples. There's no church that they even know about. So what's the point of this? Why am I sharing this? Well, it's not very effective to be doing evangelism across the barriers, particularly E2 and E3. You won't see many converts from this as a local church, at least. And again, it's the same with P2 and P3. Fewer people are willing to cross those barriers. Of course, it can happen. God's Spirit does miraculous things, but it's harder for it to happen. But as a general trend, we won't see many converts when a church is doing E2, E3 evangelism all the time. And we have to keep in mind that cultural barriers matter and they are significant, that it's not something that's insignificant. It is a factor. And so being closer to the culture, here's my point here, being closer to the culture makes a church more effective because it understands the needs, desires, and interests of those people, and it can better speak to those things. It also knows the general style that people prefer. So it's easier for people to feel like they fit at a church. So when you're doing E0, E1 evangelism, you can be a more effective church in the same way that when someone goes from P1 or P0 into the church, it's much easier for them to do that. Ultimately, we want churches within a culture to be making disciples of that culture for that reason. It's much more effective because there's many fewer barriers to the gospel. And so strategically, it's more value to invest in discipling and training leaders within a culture to evangelize it and disciple it. Of course, hear this very clearly. It's necessary to cross cultures. That to start a church where there's no church, someone has to cross a culture. So it has to happen at least initially, but the goal ultimately is to start indigenous churches. You can't really permanently exist as an E3 kind of church. You can't cross that many barriers on a regular basis and still really exist as a church. So of course, what we usually do is we send missionaries to cross barriers. They plant a church, and the goal is to plant indigenous churches in that community, in that culture, so that they then can start doing E0 and E1 evangelism. So we do E3 evangelism with the goal of starting a church, but ultimately we want churches to be doing E0 and E1 evangelism. The same thing fits with leaders. So with training national leaders, that they are closer to the culture, and so they are more effective evangelists. So it's more effective to train and disciple majority world believers so that they can plant churches. They know the culture, they know the language. And so training then can have an exponential effect rather than simply church planting across culture. Moreover, we want to train and raise up indigenous people to be trainers, scholars, and Bible teachers themselves. Again, I believe firmly in what I'm doing, but there's still barriers, right? I don't always understand the culture of the students that I'm talking to. Now I try and learn and get to know about it as much as I can. But at the end of the day, students from Pakistan, from India, from Vietnam, from the Philippines, from Indonesia, from China, these are not my native cultures. And so I'm never really going to understand them as much as the nationals that come from those countries. And so I can train people, and what I'm doing is I'm training people to be pastors or to be Bible teachers or to do campus ministry, so that they can more effectively reach those around them with the gospel. So again, there's issues like honor and shame that I've read about, I'm familiar with, but they don't mean the same things to me. Whereas if I teach a student and raise up another Bible teacher for him to go back to his home country, he can more effectively teach the Bible to local believers. Now, there is a need for people like me to go to different cultures to teach the Bible, because there are not enough people to do it. There's not enough national leaders to take care of it on their own. And at the end of the day, there is benefit of having people from different cultures on faculty together, because I think that's a way that God created us to refine one another and learn from one another. But we want to train up people who are effective, who are nationals, who can more effectively evangelize, more effectively teach the Bible, because they're going within the same culture and they are not having to cross barriers to the gospel every single time they do evangelism or they teach the Bible. And so this is one of the reasons it's so central and key to be shifting our focus from solely church planting and Bible translation to now more partnership, where we train, disciple, and equip national believers in other parts of the world. Because again, they can more effectively evangelize, they can more effectively teach the Bible, because there are not the same cultural barriers to the gospel that there are when I'm doing the same thing. We still need people to cross boundaries initially, because if a place is unreached, there's no church. So someone has to put a church there. But the goal is indigenous churches who are then reaching their own cultures. And the goal would be indigenous Bible teachers, indigenous evangelists, indigenous denominational leaders who are then able to more effectively take the gospel or teach the Bible to those within their culture. Okay, so if you're interested in reading more about this, of course, I teach and I have students cite sources, so that's what I'm doing right here is, if you're interested in learning more about this, there's the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. They have a great website and they have lots of resources available. The statistics that I got, a number of them are from the International Bulletin of Missionary Research. The article I referenced down here is by Keith Campbell. And he, again, is pushing for people with PhDs, whether it's in biology or medicine or business, or theology and Bible, to think globally, because there's a huge need for it. And then finally, the E scale and P scale come from Ralph Winter. It was developed before 2002, but there's an updated version of it in a journal in 2002. This one's available online if you just search for that article, Finishing the Task. So I hope this has helped you to see what we can do moving forward, that there are shifts that have happened, and the shifts are not for us to just stand by passively, but the shifts call for us to engage differently, to not just church plant with only Americans, but to begin partnering with the global church, and to begin putting not begin, because we've been doing it, but to put a greater focus on training and equipping nationals. We really, I think, again, that's my bias. That's what I'm involved in, and I love doing it. But there's a need to do it even more, because there is still a crying need for Bible teachers, theologians, to train up nationals so that they are equipped as pastors, so that they can become Bible teachers themselves and more effectively reach those in their cultures. So I hope this has been helpful and instructive. I'm always happy to get questions if you have them. But my goal is for you to learn something new, think through different ways to pray, and potentially be involved yourself in some of these different ways that I've mentioned.